Okay, folks, hello. Welcome to the latest MeG Podcast, and we're almost certainly the last MeG Podcast of 2021. This episode, we're going to cover a number of things, a multifaceted episode, time allowing, that is. We won't drag it on too long and insist you all listen to hours and hours and hours of us rabbiting on. The intention is to cover the recent Ribble Rumble, Ribble Rumble competition held up in Stockport. We would like to look at the 2022 changes to the army lists and a bit of reflection on how MeG competitions have gone in 2021 and look forward to what's going to happen in 2022, which hopefully will be somewhat less curtailed than this year has been. So the regulars of myself, Matt and Richard are joined by, again, two guests like last time. So welcome, please, to Graham Wilmott of Bunshot fame, and also to hi Graham, and also to the one and only James Hammy Hamilton, who most of us have known for donkey's years, and he has already promised me that he has at least one dice anecdote to tell us about. You know, no Wargaming podcast would be complete, and especially one with Hammy, without a dice anecdote. In terms of the Ribble Rumble, I keep calling it Ribble Rumble. Ugh. I've only had one beer today. The list will be on the blog as usual, but I don't think there'll be vast amounts on the blog, but we'll put the link up as normal. So I think without further ado, we'll go start off with the Ribble section. And I'm wondering if perhaps I can persuade Graham to kick us off. Throw the new boy in at the deep end,
Splosh. Right. My first game, and I think Hammy can help me out here, was against Hammy.
It was.
And his Almoravids, particularly the Meerkats. So he had a couple of units of superior spear who were a bit of a challenge for my force. I should say my force was James IV Scots, which I bought off Sid a while ago. And thought I ought to use as James IV Scots rather than feudal ones before they got nerfed. I had 9 tugs of 8 pike, their combat shite pike, and with the super duper front, fully armoured shield cover front rank. A couple of units of Hobilars who are charge only crossbow and short spear, a unit of devastating charge loose order infantry, and 6 longbow. Against Hammy, his Meerkats who were exceptional. The Black Guard were a lot to handle, and so with superior spear. I tried mobbing them with lots of units of pike and other things, but somehow it never quite came off. Never really got close to getting them down to half strength. And what ended up happening was 2 or 3 of my units exploded against his. And I went down 4-15 in the end, if I remember, Hammy. You probably remember more of the details because
it was a bit unpleasant.
Yeah.
You ended up on a table with no terrain, which was limited in help to you. I think I outscouted you.
Yes.
And I deployed my knights and my flexible cavalry on one flank, and you had nothing facing them. So they went scooting around your rear. You advanced the longbow unit a bit too far, in my opinion. And then had to cover with the 2 units of border horse against 1 unit of superior knights, and they lost. While flexible cavalry were busy visiting the camp and picking various bits of haggis or whatever they get out. They can probably more cheese because you gave some lovely cheese away. So yeah, you simultaneously lost 2 units of cavalry and the camp. I think actually you lost them on the back of committing the general to a file, and then the general died, and then everybody got upset, and the back of your army fell apart. The front of your army was struggling to get through the better troops in my army, and then it all went to pot, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's why
I think 12-4 or thereabouts, 15-4 or thereabouts. Yeah.
Yes, it was. Yes, that's right, exactly. The second game was a bit more pleasant for me. It was against Rob's Vijay. I thought I was going to say that.
Vijayanagar.
There you go.
That's my guess anyway. I'm sure plenty of Indians will now tell me it's nothing like that at all.
I'm sure they will. I mean, his infantry weren't much of a match for my pike because they were, I think, either melee expert or they were just bow armed. His elephants were, of course, a good deal better than my pike, but he hadn't got enough of them, so I could just mob them and try and kill them with white dice, which is what I did. And there wasn't really room for his cavalry to come and play, so I just ground his army down frontally until it disappeared. I was checking the score on the results. It's recorded as 15-2, but I think it was actually something like 15-4. Anyway, it wasn't a good matchup for him. He never really had much of a chance. After that, I got Steve Stead and his Sengoku Japanese on the Sunday morning, and that was a really interesting game. There was masses of terrain that went down, which is never a good thing for my force. Pike's not so happy with that, and he pushed forward with half of his infantry on his right into rough terrain, half of his infantry left centre into rough terrain, and 2 units of mounted samurai in the centre, quite close to one of the bits of rough terrain, being quite pushy against my pike. And I thought, wow, I'll have these. Push with my pike through the middle, chasing his cavalry and heading towards his camp. And somehow, I never quite got there. Whilst his infantry just kept edging forward through the rough terrain and turning over here and turning over there until my flanks fell to pieces. It timed out 2-8 to Steve, but he clearly had the upper hand. I mean, I might have got his camp, I might have got one of the units of cavalry, but no, it was Steve's game. So I went down 2-8 in that one. And finally, the last recipient of the gift pieces of Lanarkshire blue cheese was Richard Balashevsky. He had French ordnance, and he'd had the misfortune to play John Munro in a previous game, and so he was convinced that he couldn't possibly beat a James IV Pike army, and we all know that sort of thing is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
He got French ordnance, which, it's not a bad matchup, really. Not great, but not terrible, with the men-at-arms and the pike and yada yada. And he had a big lump of rough going on his baseline in the centre, and a fair-sized bit on his right flank. So he put 3 units of bow and some men-at-arms in the centrepiece. Most of his army on his right centre and right flank, it's a secure flank, obviously, in the gap with pike and men-at-arms and kitchen sink and knight and heaven knows what. And a unit of poor longbow on his right in the rough going. So I thought I'd have slightly outscouted him. I saw it go down. I thought, well, I'll have those. Pushed up with the devastating charges, the gentry and Kythern, and a unit of average longbow. And sure enough, he says, moving the cat again, they did manage to take the single. Oh, look, it's back. The single unit of poor longbow. He saw what was happening, that I was going to roll up his line, and started to push forward. And one unit of his longbow was particularly impressive. It charged a unit of my pike, desperation or whatever, I don't know. My pike thought, oh, we'll have these. Did they? Hell. After a charge and 2 rounds of melee, I'd lost 3 bases of pike, and their longbows were intact. Come on, you bastard. We'll have you. Unfortunately for them, the gentry and Kythern had turned around and just played a blinder. Having destroyed the longbow, turned around, charged into the flank of the knights, broke them at impact, charged into the flank of the Swiss halberds, broke them at impact, hit the side of the Swiss pike block, thought, tell you what, we'll take a break here, we'll just have them in the melee round. Had them in the melee round, pursued into the flank of, I think, another pike block, broke that at impact, pursued that into the flank during the charge phase of a unit of men-at-arms and broke them, and then turned round to face the rest of my army, saying, where were you bastards then? We won the game. Because that was Richard's army. Admittedly, the Kythern had a little bit of help because most of the units being hit were engaged frontally, but they weren't doing too badly frontally until this Kythern juggernaut hit them. It was quite stunning.
So let me see. Basically, 600 points of Highlanders took out Richard's army.
Yes, that's a fair reflection. I don't think Richard would argue with that.
It is perhaps worth stressing that they are sort of average protected, devastating chargers. So
yes,
with charge only power bow, so they aren't exactly the troops you necessarily expect to achieve such mighty heights. But
not really.
Clearly,
it gives them a plaque and they're on +6.
I'm sure they were probably knackered at the end of that.
Yeah, I think they were.
It was, That is mightily impressive. Yeah, I have to say. I've got, if you don't mind, I've got one question on your army.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I think these James IV armies, to some degree, write themselves, don't they? You're going to have a very large number of those pike units. But how did you find those? You had 2 units of border horse that were both 4s. Now,
Yes.
So you're saying obviously against Hammy, they didn't really work that well. But how did they work in the other games? Because
as I recall, against Rob, I think they did okay against his cavalry because he pushed a little bit too hard with a unit of Indian cavalry, and I managed to get the charge only bit to work quite well. Did a bit of damage with the crossbow at the charge, and then followed up with the long spear at impact. And if I remember rightly, Rob might correct me, I think that, together with a bit of shooting from another unit, broke those cavalry. Against Richard, they had to face the knights who were coming out to play, and that would not have ended well, except the Kytham, that was the first unit they hit in the flank. So they just gritted their teeth and survived the impact, and then the Kytham came to their rescue. Against Steve, they were part of the delaying force on split between my left and right flanks, and it was a nightmare game for them. Their charge-only crossbow didn't work. Whatever they hit at impact was rolling up, and they were rolling down, and they just both went poof. Oh, right. They're not really there to win things. They're there to slow people down, and occasionally do in desperation what they did against Hammy, which doesn't end well.
The listener, Hammy is shaking his head.
Yes.
Sort of shaking his head in agreement, if you see what I mean. It didn't end well. So I'm trying to remember, where did you finish in the end, Graham?
I think I finished about 11th out of 22, something like that, just about, well, at halfway, yeah.
Yeah, about mid-table. So
it wasn't glorious.
Yeah, but did you like using the army overall?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I'm still getting to grips with Meg. I started in May, as you know, so I'm. It's a good army to build up your experience with. It's not the most exciting thing in the world. Possibly it's the most boring thing in the world. But I would like to get onto more combined arms forces as I get more experience, and ultimately aspire to the heights of shooty cavalry. But I think I'm a long way off being any good at that.
Well, I remember earlier this year bigging you up after playing you at Battlefield Hobbies.
Oh, yeah.
I thought you had the makings of a shooty cavalry general.
Well, I might be giving Hittites a run out soon. We'll see. I might try them at Ice and Fire. I'm not sure yet. I'll have a few practice games against Paul, which is always a sobering experience, and see how I do.
Great stuff.
Can I ask, Graham, you made reference to the army list change that's coming up for 2022, which will be that if using the Pavis as the extra shield cover, you won't be able to prompt through the fire for that one base width slow. So that if you're using that shield cover, you will be restricted to a maximum of 2 base widths. Do you think that really is going to significantly hinder the Scots army?
I don't think it will. No. I mean, I like the change, and thanks for the 20 quid bung you sent me earlier. It's a really clever solution. And it feels right. I mean, if you're using that great big heavy shield, then it ought to slow you down a bit. So I think it feels right. Is it going to be a big handicap? No, it isn't, I don't think. I think there's plenty of ways to get around it. It might cost you a turn at worst, but I don't think it's a big deal. The much bigger change is going to 12 strong pike blocks. But do you want to cover that now, Nick? Or
sure. No, it's come up. Yeah, we'll go on. Yeah.
There, I think, okay, you'll have fewer units, so you'll have slightly better command and control. You'll either be able to dance a bit more, or you'll be save on general costs, I suppose. But looking at some of John Munro's games, and he obviously uses this army very well, you see a starburst effect of the units going in all directions, and having more units, you can do that because you're not showing so many flanks. If you've only got, 2/3 as many units, you're going to show more flanks. You have to be a bit more cautious. I think it could be quite a handicap for the army. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
I was going to say, Richard, do you just want to explain to the listeners why this 12 base instead of 8 base change was made?
Okay, so it was really partly in response to the starburst effect, because it was never the intention to allow the James IV Scottish to do that. It was also that pretty much all the other contemporary armies in the Italian Wars period use pikes in 12, so it was felt to be more representative within the period, which was era after.
And after all, I think the record is that the Scots were trained by French supply drill masters, basically, weren't they? So they would be using continental tactics, which were the very big pike blocks.
Yes, I believe James IV imported Italian armourers and French commanders to train up his force. It was unfortunate. It met an end sort of trying to advance down a marshy steep hill, which is probably the best description of the terrain at Flodden, which was never going to end well, really, for pike units. I recommend you don't try it in MeG.
Well,
yeah, in terms of Graham's army, it probably reduces 8 pike units down to 5. You could possibly tweak the army for 6, but it's you're losing sort of 3 units in terms of the same number of pike, I guess.
Yeah, Paul Stavel's been trying to persuade me to take 4 units in future. I'm deeply unconvinced, but usually when Paul says something, he's got some good idea behind it. So maybe I'll try it at some stage.
An individual unit of 8 is beatable if you get decent troops against it. A unit of 12 is going to take a while to go down.
It's going to become more an issue of flanks, I suspect.
Yeah, I mean, if you can, what I found fighting Graham was that I was in a number of places where I had a single unit of pike with two overlaps against it, so you've got 4 dice against 2 frontage, and that actually will wear them down relatively quickly as long as your troops are okay. And I was able to get a lot of those fights on green dice because superior long spear or exceptional tends to work quite nicely. In that situation, having a wider unit of pike will actually make them better, in my opinion. Just less manoeuvrable. And once you take the front rank off a pike block in that situation, it just disintegrates.
Oh, I certainly found that when I played Skull Rollers, although the way it worked out, I didn't actually take front rank pikemen off till quite late in the game, and he beat me. But when you did, they could collapse really, really quickly. But I think the 12s will make that last long. It'll change the army a bit, won't it? It's
yeah.
It'll
make it tougher, but harder to get big wins, I suspect.
I'm sure we'll wait and see what happens in next year. If anybody uses them again, if you do, or John or anybody else gives them a run out in their new format. Okay, shall we move on to Hammy? Since you've already contributed somewhat on your game against Graham.
Yeah, can do. Why not?
So tell us how the exceptional meerkats did in the rest of the competition.
So I wasn't sure what army to take. I had a conversation with Will. The meerkats are some figures I bought years and years ago, and finally got them painted this year. Will did them, and I tarted them up and based them. And Will's comment was, must use meerkats. Okay, well, fair enough. They are Arab meerkats after all, so they should be in an army. In case I was playing against somebody who was particularly difficult, I brought along some ordinary Arab spearmen as well, so that I could use proper Arab figures rather than the meerkats. But yeah, the meerkats are simply brilliant. No cunning use of simple there. Cunning use of simple. I looked at the I wanted an army that could have one super good unit of infantry, and Almoravid is the one that does that. It gives you the exceptional infantry. I couldn't work out how to get 2 units of superior long spear. Just the points didn't quite work for me, and I ended up with 4, I think. I had the meerkats, I had the unit superiors, I had 4 average shield wall short spear infantry, which are not particularly exciting, but take a while to kill. Unit of crossbowmen, a unit of knights, and some flexible cavalry, plus 5 decent skirmisher units. So I had two units of Cantabrian light horse, 1 unit of archers, 2 units of javelinmen. 1 was poor because that's just the way the points worked out. Objective of the army is to get the good troops, being the superior, the meerkats, the superior long spear, and the knights, to fight things that they can kill and kill them, using the other spear kind of as a sit back and encourage the other guy to come for them because they'll beat them. Game 1 against Graham, the meerkats and the superior spears fought his pikes. The cavalry got round his flank. His army fell to pieces, as we've already described. I possibly got a bit lucky killing the border horse as quickly as I did. If I'd not killed them then, there was a flank charge from some longbow into my knights that would have happened. In a lot of ways, I was looking at that as, well, the border horse were going to die anyway, and then the knights would be fighting the longbowmen. And if they charge me in the flank, it's not that bad because I'm superior and on a horse. That game went completely to plan, which is nice and easy. Game 2, this is the dice story. Fighting Ray using 100 Years' War. Another medieval. There were a lot of medieval armies that I consider to have a crunchy crust. So obviously you've got the James IV Scots with the different front rank, and then the 100 Years' War English, where half his longbowmen had front rank melee expert and the rest didn't. And he's got the men at arms and he can interpenetrate. Apparently only in the movement phase. That might be wrong, but that's what he told me. So that's the way we played it. And basically in that game, I set up to get the exceptional meerkats into a couple of units of longbow and a unit of men at arms. He had the men at arms in a single rank behind the longbow. No, in front of the longbow initially. And a unit of billmen to the side of them. And I thought, I'll throw my knights into the billmen and throw my meerkats into the men at arms or the longbow. Not too worried which way around that went. Protect their flank with some superior spear, and see how things go. Got my troops into the right place. Ray had conveniently moved his longbowmen through the men at arms, so they're now out in front facing the exceptional meerkats. And I think, yes, this will work. Pile in 8 exceptional meerkat bases into 2 units of longbow, plus the knights charged in at a cunning angle and got 1 base fighting the rear of a fight of longbowmen rather than the billmen. The knights killed the base of longbow, and the meerkats only lost one wound from charging into the longbowmen. The men at arms are immediately behind, providing an overlap against my knights, but that's good because when the longbowmen break, they rout not in the movement phase. So that's a cab for bursting through the men at arms and a cab for the longbowmen breaking. Should be good. About 3 melee rounds later, I finally broke both units of longbow, having lost 3 bases of meerkats doing it. This isn't right.
I note here a wave of laughter and no sympathy at all.
Are you saying it wasn't simple?
Yeah, so the meerkats are a bit tatty, but it's okay. I've got 4 yellow cabs on the men at arms because two lots of things have gone. And I've also got 2 yellow cabs on the billmen. I did 1 wound on the men at arms from the 4 yellow cabs and nothing to the billmen. The meerkats pile into the front of the billmen anyway, at the same time as I get charged in the flank by some combat-shy crossbowmen because my superior spears have not been able to kill whatever it was they were fighting, which was, I think it was probably pike with a double overlap. Unfortunately, the meerkats died. Now, they'd done a bit of damage along the way, and the billmen were nearly half strength, but the knights also fell down at that point, and both my strike units on that flank are dead. I finally killed the pike that had been slowing on my superior spear. So he's got a few units destroyed, and I think I got another unit somewhere else. But unfortunately, I've lost most of my good units, and he's had the time to get into the average squishy pike blokes. And I think I also lost the flexible cavalry. In the end, I lost enough units that my army fell over. It's not very big. It's only 9, so it breaks on 5 down. You don't expect to lose the meerkats and the superior knights in a position. I planned to go and refight that and roll the dice, because in my head that was I should have walked all over him combat, and then I didn't. And you can't work out the probabilities in MeG, but I think it's worth. That was one which felt so good to me that I should just completely smash him, and then I didn't, and that was a bit puzzling. I mean, the meerkats ended up fighting 5 wide, so I had 5 bases in contact with longbowmen. I relatively quickly killed one of the melee expert bases, so I'm on yellow dice, and I should murder him, and I didn't.
There isn't a lot more you can say about that, is there?
15-8, I think, something like that. Might have been 15-6. I think it was 15-8 or 7.
It was 15-8. I just looked it up.
Yeah. Disappointing. At the point my troops got into contact with Ray, he was basically saying, "Oh, I appear to have done this spectacularly wrong." And I'm thinking, "Yes, Ray, you do." Yeah. Then I rolled a skull, and he complained that I rolled a skull. He complained that I was rolling skulls all the time. I'm thinking, I've only rolled 1 or 2, and then just the wheels fell off. It happens. It happens. It's hard with the army to. It is so vital to make the meerkats work, the blackguard work, because, and often what I found in the next game, that the blackguard were fighting 6 wide, which was quite fun, because you don't need rear rank, you have short spear. It's great. Anyway, next game, Sunday morning, I ended up fighting Will and his samurai. There was a post on the WhatsApp group, and people were saying, "What are your crossbowmen doing, getting charged by his cavalry?" Answer: distracting his cavalry from doing anything very important. Basically, another game where I'm trying to get the superior spear and the exceptional infantry into combat as fast as I can with as much as I can. The exceptionals ended up hitting 2 units. The superiors hit 2 units. The rest of my army was largely held back. I had an open flank facing 2 units of rather nasty samurai cavalry. I think he has 2 foot. They're 4s. They're superior, short spear, skilled power bow. They're melee expert. They're proper nasty, and nothing on a horse in my army can face them. And the only troops on foot that can face them are the ones I want to be fighting things that aren't them. So I needed to put something in the way of those that would just distract them. My flank was a little bit open, but I was able to push my tribal crossbowmen out to the left flank, so that if they did come in, I'd be shooting them. And he didn't want that. So he decided that his solution would be to charge and deal with my crossbows. Fine, I don't mind. Kill the crossbows. They can die. And they did. 1 unit of crossbow, the crossbow evaporated. 1 of his units of cavalry ended up pursuing onto some short spears, which is fine. And the other one ended up facing some short spears at short range, but with skirmishing archers shooting them. So from that point, those 2 units of cavalry were, I won't say out of the game, but they weren't actually contributing anything important. Meanwhile, in the middle of the battle, my decent infantry were doing their job. My superior knights had lined up to actually take on the skilled powerbow blokes, the proper samurai in his army, with the cunning plan of having a unit of poor skirmishing foot in front of them, so that they just soak up all the arrows until you get to the point where you'll get 1 round before you get in. Will was quite clever. He swapped over 2 units. That's not worth. He was 100% out scouted. Didn't help him. Help him very much. He swapped over the 2 units of troops, so that now my knights weren't facing the skilled powerbow blokes. But my other unit of skirmishing javelin were able to absorb the shots. The knights managed to get to a position where they were in range to charge, and I threw them into there. At the same time as the Cantabrian light horse were busy shooting average long spear to death. So his army apart from the cavalry, once they were relatively neutralised, just struggled. The unit, he had a unit of crossbowmen that actually lost to one base of meerkats. Single base of meerkats broke the crossbowmen. We had an interesting situation where I had a long line of troops, and the end base of my unit hit the middle of the crossbowmen. So bizarrely, ended up fighting double overlapped, even though it had a friend to its right, which I think is probably wrong. And I think that was an incorrect umpiring decision, but we'll not worry about that too much. I had a contiguous line. The base on the end of my line was fighting the middle of the crossbow unit. The next base in my line was fighting a spear unit, but the crossbow were at an angle. And as a result, there were bases either side of the crossbow base I was fighting. The photo did get shared, and there was a bit of discussion and some debate as to how it all worked, and different people had different opinions. It was ruled I was double overlapped. Didn't matter. Killed the base the fire was in, killed the general in the unit ran away. So it was simple. Exactly.
I mean, yeah. Aligning always throws up oddities, and having had to rule on it numerous times myself, I have great sympathy with anybody who has to make the decision on some of the more unusual cases.
I couldn't align, and I wanted, because my unit was quite wide. I think I was 5 wide in that one. I ended up stepping forward, and yeah, I had one base on its own fighting the middle of the unit of bowmen. Didn't matter, still beat them. So,
actually, morally the right result.
Possibly. So yeah, that gave me another 15. Don't think I lost. I think I only lost 2 units, 1 or 2 units in that, probably. Was either 15-2 or 15-4. Can't remember. And my final game was now on top table, fighting Sid with yet another army with a crunchy crust. Frisians, they're weird, really weird. Combat shy, long spear, devastating chargers.
Yep.
With the rear ranks unprotected. Very, very weird indeed.
One of my better efforts, I believe.
Troop type, and it's kind of, I'm sure it reflects something quite. They felt maybe like Catalan companies should almost feel, because they're not that vulnerable to cavalry because they've got the long spear, but they're loose, so they can play around in terrain. It was fun. I went with Plan A of insert as many good spearmen and things as I could into Sid's army as fast as I could, but had 3 tugs of the short spears to the left of. I was pushing effectively in the center. 3 tugs to the left, just facing these weird mixed up guys, because I'd worked out actually I'm kind of even against them ish in melee, and I've got units of 8 and he's got units of 8, and once he starts losing front ranks I can probably kill him. I had some skirmishes on I think the flexible cavalry were on my left. No, it wasn't flexibles, it was the light horse out on the left that managed to sneak round and just lob some javelins, but did very little damage because everybody was too engaged in combat. In the Sid actually did a group withdrawal with a bunch of his stuff, but pushed forward with a single unit of spearmen, and this one unit of spearmen hit both my superior spear and my exceptionals at the same time, one base into each file, as a delaying action. Basically, he threw it forward to stop me getting further forward with my nasty stuff. It worked. It held up the nasty things for probably 2 or 3 turns before it finally vaporized. On the other flank, he had a German ally with 2 decent units of knights, one average, one superior, and also some Frisian cavalry with a general that they had like 3 cards for 1 unit of cavalry that could kind of do what it wanted. And I was facing these with just my 1 unit of superior knights and my flexible cavalry. I figured the flexible cavalry were definitely going to die. I had some skirmishes as well. That managed to keep them out of the way. The flexible cavalry were always going to die because they were facing 3 cards worth of cavalry. The superiors didn't really like facing 12 knights. Even though I've got 6, he's got 12. It's not great. I think he was superior melee expert, dev charge. No, he was superior fully armored dev charge, his knights, and his other ones are average fully armored dev charge. And I was superior melee expert. So I wasn't down against, I was all right against one of those 2 units, but not against both. My knights were able to redeploy from out on my right flank where they were to a bit more central, and then got charged by his superior knights, but with the average ones a fair way away. And amazingly, over charge combat and a round of melee, I broke him for no loss, which is astounding. Okay, he charged in. I think I took a wound, and that was it on the charge with green white. And I had the choice of what to do with these cavalry. I could my knights. I could either invest in them to try and get them to win the fight, or leave them to die, and actually leave a couple of other units out, hanging out, maybe to die as well. But by expanding on both flanks, I ended up with a double overlap, general with the unit. I had a card ready to recover wounds. I wasn't expecting to win in 1 round, but I ended up on a 5 dice versus 3. Overlaps are only white, but white's still better than nothing. And as it happens, I think I managed to take a base off in the impact as well. So I got lucky on the white dice in the impact. And after the melee phase, he was broke. It was like, whoa. And I didn't even have a wound on my unit. I took no wounds on the impact. I took 1 wound in the melee and I recovered that. So my unit was completely healthy and charged forward. Ended up fighting one of the crunchy units. I then got charged in the flank by the average knights and kind of ignored that. And that then bogged down into a fight that went on for a fairly long period. Basically, neither army was going to go down in this game. Sid had played a bit cagily at the start, but he was in a strong position. He had 45 points going into the last game. He could afford to. He needed to get points off me, but equally he couldn't afford his army to collapse. And partly because of the way my army's configured, unless he goes for skirmishers, he's not actually going to get 10 points without breaking. 12 points maximum without breaking me. I think the end score was 10 to Sid or 8 to Sid. I got about half a dozen. I did some damage. I took a few units, at least 2 or 3 units down. And I was at a point where, given a few more turns, I would have taken some more down. What we came to a mutual agreement. It's like, well, we'll get 2 more rounds in maximum. We worked out what would happen in those 2 rounds and then called it. It was a good game, interesting, very interesting army. And I definitely an unusual troop type, Richard. So there you go. That was like, okay, that's different.
Yeah, they are weird, but it shows what you can do with some of the characteristics and putting some of the old combinations. Because the combat shy and long spear and dev charger, so it sort of means it, the long spear and combat shy cancel each other out in a way.
They do, but they mean that
they're good against cavalry. So,
yes, yeah,
and with the dev charger, they've always got the shatter possibility as well. So
yeah,
it's an interesting army. So.
An army I'd certainly consider trying. It's one of those where I sometimes play an army and think, "Ooh, that's interesting. I wonder if there's something there."
Yeah.
Basically, he had lots of the crunchy troops, plus some spears, plus a unit of crossbows, plus 2 units of knights, 1 unit of other mounted that were okay, but not great. No skirmishers. I mean, something I noticed across all 4 games I played, not one of my opponents had a SUG.
Yeah, well, some of us in this podcast have been a bit banging on about about people not using them. I know you've used them for a long time very effectively. Richard's been advocating them for a long time, and I think off the back of you two, I've started advocating them, and they work very well for me with my Hittites at warfare.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. I actually, one of the things I did in my army, I took non-combat shy light horse, skirmishing light horse. The objective being that they can deal with opponent SUGs. go to a medieval event. Nobody's got any sugs. It's like, okay, that was a waste of points then.
I'm sure they were useful. And anyway, let's move on to Matt to complete the three of you who are playing there. And I can tell you now, his army didn't have any sugs, but it had a lot of troops that could skirmish. And it's another one of Matt's mad armies. I suspect he took it because it was exactly 10,000 points.
Yeah, pretty much. It was between that and the later medieval Polish, I have to say. It was going to be one of those two. And Ray had been banging on with me to use the early Lithuanian for ages. So that was it, early Lithuanian. It's a very simple army. It's a 14-card cavalry army, basically. It's 3 blocks of 6 superior, formed loose, protected, unskilled javelin, short spear, melee expert cavalry. It's then 4 average versions of that cavalry, then 1 unarmored version of that cavalry, and then 3 blocks of 4 poor rubbish cavalry, all form flexible. All the blocks of 6 are melee expert, short spear, unskilled javelin, so they can all skirmish. They're all formed flexible, sorry, not formed loose. So they can run around and be happy, basically. I will say now, the only time that I out-scouted my opponent, considering I had 8 PBS cards and 7 scouting cards, was against Pete Entwistle in the last round. I got out-scouted by a medieval Irish army with 2 cards. I got out-scouted by a Ming Chinese army with 4 cards. And I can't even remember who the other person was at the moment, but they out-scouted me as well. Anyway, so there you go. So the only person that managed it was Pete. Only person I managed to out-scout was Pete. So there you go. Right. So first round, I got Jeff with his medieval Irish, which is always an army that I quite like the look of, but never have the bravery to run. Yes, so he out-scouts me. The terrain is basically, he has a large river on one flank, making it secure. And we had a couple of very small pieces of it. It was either wood or forest that fell right on the outskirts. So his army, coincidentally, was just big enough to fit between the forest and the river in a nice big block. And he was running... so from my left, he had the army commander. It was the Bruce version of the medieval Irish. So he had the army commander, which had 2 blocks of long spear, men at arms. I think there was another unit in there. I can't remember what it was. Then he had an Islesman ally, which was 2 blocks of protected 2-handed cut and thrust dev chargers, I think, backed up by just dev chargers. Now, that was quite a brave choice for Jeff, because that was a mediocre allied general. So next to those, he then deploys the internal Irish 2-handed cut and thrust guys, who I'm not even going to attempt to say. Nick, you're usually good at this. How do you pronounce it? Is it Galogak or?
I've always just said Galaglash or something close.
That
how drunk you are. And...
yeah. So what he had was 3 blocks of the average and 1 block of the superiors, all in 8s, which he deployed 4 deep, 2 wide. And then he went 2 blocks of the loose order Kerns, 2 blocks of 6, I think it was, which were on the other flank next to the wood, and then some skirmishers in the wood themselves, the skirmishing Kerns. So what was I to do? The long spear Scots on the flank, I really didn't want to fight, so they got a couple of rubbish, poor 4-man blocks of cavalry to play with and a single block of the unarmored. My 4 blocks of average went straight for his Galgash in the center, basically to pin them in place, because I'm unskilled javelin, so I can always skirmish away. And coincidentally, 4 was sufficiently wide to cover his frontage, and 3 to cover his frontage. And then I sent 2 blocks of superiors straight at his. Well, the aim was to go straight at his Islesman allies, and a block of superior and a block of average was going to go straight for his loose order Kerns, which were also in the open. So round 1, Jeff duly throws the 2 blacks out for the mediocre Islesman ally. So they immediately each take a cab because they've gone desperately unreliable and lose a wound and a base, I think. So Jeff was not having a good start before it had even kicked off, and it basically went to plan. My dross on the flank kept the Scots completely occupied. They just didn't get involved. The superior, 2 blocks of superiors went straight into the Islemen whilst they were still deciding whether they wanted to fight. So I hit loose order troops, average loose order troops in the open. So they're combat shy. 2-handed cut and thrust doesn't count for anything. They're loose, hit by superior charging short spear cavalry. They lasted the turn. They both blew up, and I went straight through his line in a turn. So one block went and hit the camp immediately, and the other block rallied and went to play with his his Irish light cavalry, which was lurking at the back. His big mob of cut and thrusts did nothing for the entire game. As I said, I literally just walked backwards from them. If they charged me, I skirmished back, and the Kerns on the side got hit by the superiors, who broke both of them. I think my superiors actually broke at the same time. I think 12 versus 6, even when I'm superior short spear melee expert. That the attritional rate of throwing blacks and whites against greens and yellows, it could have gone either way. But anyway, I think we mutually broke. The loss of his camp plus some damage I did to his cavalry, I think, was enough to break his army, and he fled. And that was it. I think it was a 6-15 or an 8-15 in the end. So it was a good game. The Isleman ally he didn't need, because that basically stalled his entire line, and he couldn't do anything about it till they came online. Otherwise, without exposing the flanks of both sides.
My reaction is that medieval Irish army needs to. It can have plenty of skirmishers, and it needs to use them if it's going to face opponents like yours. Because if he had a fair number of skirmishers, I think your army would suffer quite a bit. Matt?
I don't disagree. I was expecting a lot more than he only put us 2 units of 6 or something down, I think. I was expecting a lot more, and I was not expecting as many 2-handed cut and crush weapons in there. I thought there was a lot more than he needed to have. I was expecting more cavalry, to be perfectly honest. But even so, he didn't need it. He got the 2 reds to outscout me. Not that I'm bitter about that. But, anyway.
But it must be said, a mediocre ally is brave. And I'm guessing he took a lot of 2-handed cut and crush because he was expecting to fight lots of heavy metal.
Oh yeah, I can see the logic for it, but I think it kind of hampered what he was trying to achieve. It made him too narrow, I think. But because he didn't need to be 4 deep against me, I don't think. Frank 3, or it would just have broadened him out a bit more and made it a little harder for me to stop him. Stop the good stuff from getting involved.
Yeah, I think I've found this with people facing my shooty cavalry armies. If they put sort of 2 wide, 4 deep, I'm quite happy because they're easier to slow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, your next game.
My next game was Ian Cosby with Medieval Swedish. Now, Medieval Swedish is an army that is on my to-do list. I actually like to look at that. There's some interesting quirks to that one. It's the period Ian took it at. It has to have Ledang, which are tribal close polearm foot, and you can also though take mixed crossbowman polearm. So your front rank is polearm crossbow flexible, formed flexible, and rear rank just formed loose crossbowman. But you have to take it in a proportion of you have to have twice as many Ledang as you have these mixed crossbowman units. So it's got a really interesting mix of terrain. Unfortunately for the both of us, basically, Ian got a massive maximum size piece of rough going, which straddled the center of the table. There were forests and woods on the flanks, which they had no impact on the game. This central basically meant he could form a V when he deployed, so he had his Ledang on either side of this rough going to his table edge, and then he had all his crossbowmen in the rough itself. Basically made it very hard. Don't get me wrong, the game went to a pace, but it was a lot of maneuver to try and get anything to happen. In the end, I had him stretched out. His crossbowmen in the rough were facing in 3 different directions because my cavalry was basically all around it. The cavalry had moved on to both flanks. One was delaying the tribal foot on one side, and all my superiors were on the other, facing 2 blocks of these 2 blocks of 9. I think they were all in 9s. 2 blocks of these tribal polearm close order foot, and he had his cavalry by his camp, basically 3 blocks of 4 of varying flavors of dev charging knights effectively, but he couldn't, because they were in 4s, he couldn't afford to let them out and roam free with them because I was just going to swamp them, so they were sat at the back. I got it into a stage where I successfully got this, forced him basically, because forced his tribal to charge my superior cavalry, because I was basically sat there throwing unskilled javelins at him, and all right, fair play, it's unskilled, so I'm throwing blacks, but it was whittling him down, and I think he got frustrated by it, so he charged them. And so the superiors had actually broken one of these units of polearm. I'd actually managed to force one of his crossbowman units into a situation where, once again, my cavalry is fighting in rough terrain. I managed to charge him frontally and in the flank with 2 blocks of cavalry and broke them in fairly quick order. Because again, decent cavalry in rough going isn't that bad against form loose, even polearm loose, particularly when they're being hit in the flank. So, but that's when it got called. Unfortunately, I managed to make a hole in the center and was working my way to the next crossbowman when we ran out of time. So it was a 6-4, I think. I was happy with the position, but from the moment that terrain went down, I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere. It just forced the game out into the wilderness, basically. But good game, and that was end of day 2. So I wasn't displeased with the performance of the nutty Lithuanians. They did as was expected. Round 3, I got Sam Street and his Ming Chinese, which is actually the kind of army my army really likes to fight. It's a mix of foot, unprotected nomadic Mongols, and some internal Ming Chinese cavalry, which are all experienced bow, short spear, not melee expert, which my guys are. So if I can get in, it's a good fight. And also, because he's experienced bow, short spear, he's actually quite expensive. His foot is a mix of crossbowmen and polearm troops. Again, wide open table, which didn't necessarily hinder either of us really. A large piece of rough on one side and a forest on the other. Oh, sorry, a wood on my right. And as is always my way, I ambushed 3 units of cavalry in the wood. All my superiors, in fact. And
what is it with you and cavalry and woods?
I know. I honestly think it's the scene in Gladiator where he charges his cavalry into the German barbarians in the wood. I swear that's where it comes from, and I just urge to recreate it. But yeah. So they were in the wood, but I also I double faked flank marches, which I don't often do, and I don't know why, because there's absolutely no cost in the rules for doing it. So I double blinded him basically, and so Sam, I think he outscouted me by a mere 30% or something with his 4 to my 7 cards. Again, not bitter. No, let's not go there. Sam was in a bit of a bind, and he's fairly sensibly decided that where this rough was, he had a feeling that was where I was going to try and come through, because it just didn't seem the most obvious, because it was opposite where the ambush was. And so he deployed a lot of his foot on that flank to stop me rushing behind him. The problem was, of course, it was a blind. So when we kicked off, basically my entire army was fighting 2/3 of his army, and it was 2/3 of the army that really doesn't want to get embroiled in a cavalry battle with protected short spear melee expert. So Sam tried to delay whilst desperately trying to get his infantry across to get involved. It didn't work. The 3 superiors leapt out of the wood into his Chinese Chinese Ming cavalry that were holding the flank, and they just couldn't stop them. They just didn't have enough grunt to hold them long enough, and I chased him back to the table edge, pinned him on the table edge, killed 2 units. The average melee expert cavalry by then had gone through his middle section and was turning on his nomadic Mongols, and I think he broke on 5. Possibly 6. I think we got the camp as well, which did it. Yes, it was the camp that gave me the 6th, and it basically collapsed for him. And I think it was a fairly brutal scoreline. I think it was 15-0. Yeah, it was 15-0, which is really harsh actually, because he had quite a few of my units teetering and had a few of my units where they had nowhere to run, particularly a couple of my poor units that I've been using to slow down his infantry and stuff. So he deserved more for the effort he put into the game. And but yeah, it was another good game, played in good stead, and cavalry did what they were supposed to do. That took me round 4 against Pete. I don't think I was in with a shot of top. I might have been in with a shot for a 3rd placing if I did really well against Pete, but it was unlikely. Pete was about 5 points ahead of me when we started. The train went down. I had a bit of a brain fart moment, to be brutally honest, and I'd misjudged where I wanted the terrain counter to be, and where I wanted to put woods down, I ended up forcing myself to put forests down, which was a bit irritating. Particularly when I decided on my deployment choices, I counted them as woods when I put my ambushes in them, and then remembered afterwards that they were forests, which meant, of course, my cavalry was only moving 2, so they weren't going to get out quick enough. Yeah, and the way the terrain had fallen because of where I ended up choosing it, it meant, even though I'd fully outscouted Pete, I knew how he was going to deploy anyway. It's basically going to be a long line between, I think it was a vineyard that he put down on one flank and a forest on the other, and it was just going to be a straight line and give me no real places to play. So before we started, I was pretty much sure Pete was going to get a 15 out of it because I had nowhere to run. It was just a question of how many tugs I could get off him to see where I finished. It started badly when, unrelated to the game, I disappeared from view from Pete, ducking his power bow when my chair collapsed, which was a little unfortunate as it aggravated an existing injury. So we played on for a couple of turns, but I was in too much pain, and I think I may be the first person to ever retire hurt from a wargaming. You know, I don't know how that gets recorded. So unfortunately, Pete didn't get a game and got 15-0 scoreline. But as I say, I don't think even if we'd have played the game, Pete would have got anything other than a 15 from the way the lay of the land was. So I'm not certainly. I certainly didn't give him a cheap win to the top, so to speak. So yeah, it was what it was, really.
And that's just really unfortunate. And hopefully you are somewhat recovered now.
Yes, I'm on my way. Fortunately, I didn't do anything that is going to aggravate my existing issues. So that's good. But yeah, it was a bit of a flat to the weekend. Other than that, really enjoyed the Lithuanians. They were doing a lot better than I was expecting. And as I said to Nick earlier or offline, next year I'm running infantry just to prove that I can. Honest enough. or equally prove that I can't run infantry. I don't know. We'll see what the end result is.
Yeah, that's your starting point anyway. So, okay, guys, thanks very much for your accounts of your games, which have been interesting, most amusing in places. Dice woes and Matt's really unfortunate actual physical injury woe at the ends, but good to know you're feeling better. And obviously, I think we say well done to Pete for winning the competition. Matt's already said that he feels he would have won it regardless of his falling off a chair or the chair collapsing at the end. So, these things happen. They are what they are. So there you are. So I suggest we now move on to what might be the controversial bit, which is looking at the changes to the army lists. As we all know, army lists get updated every year. The vast majority of these changes are pretty minor, but sometimes there's something in there which can materially affect an army, or affect it in some way. And of course, changes. So I say affect, I don't necessarily mean negative either. We've already touched on the ones about the James IV Scottish Army, which Graham was discussing earlier. So we won't repeat that. I think as Richard is our listmeister, he will be the one to take us through these other changes. I'm hoping he doesn't go ahead with his threat and go through every single change, including all the spelling corrections and punctuation. And then we just stick to the material ones, because I say a lot of them are minor tweaks where small errors have crept in over time or whatever. So we'll go through that. I'm hoping that everybody here will contribute with their thoughts about some of these changes. I'm going to suggest to Richard that he starts with the one that's possibly caused the most angst online, which are the changes to some of the late Japanese lists, including lists that were used at Ribble Rumble, the Sengoku Japanese. So if Richard starts there, and I'll let him perhaps explain why the change has been made as well as what the change is. So just to drop you in it, Richard.
Thank you, Nick, for that. Yes, okay. Well, I wasn't planning to start off with the Japanese, but okay.
Well, to be honest, if you want to start with another one, Richard, it's up to you.
We'll go with the Japanese list then. So the tweak to the Japanese lists is essentially that with the later samurai lists, the samurai in mixed tugs, so this is Kamakura, Muromachi, Sengoku, Nobunaga, and Takeda, and if I've mispronounced those, I apologize to all our Japanese listeners. So in the mixed tugs, the samurai shoot in one rank. This change was intentional to prevent players distorting the tugs by deploying to the front rank elements, or what was intended to be the front rank elements, too deep, and therefore getting the more effective shooting in particular. That's a relatively straightforward change. It doesn't make a huge difference, because typically if you were shooting in two ranks with a green dice, you're now getting two white dice instead by being forced to have them in the one rank. The perhaps controversial change, although quite frankly why it's controversial I still don't understand, was reducing the mounted samurai from skilled power bow to experienced power bow. Skilled power bow is essentially the most powerful combination you could have, and it was disproportionate compared to any army that you might consider the Japanese having faced. As experienced power bow, they're considerably cheaper, 60 points a base cheaper, and the firing effect is still very powerful in my opinion. So I really don't see it as being a huge disadvantage to the Japanese armies. If you want the skilled power bow, you dismount, or use dismounted samurai. They are still skilled power bow. So I really have no apologies or regrets with that change at all.
Can I just chip in and just make the point that because for shooting at other cavalry, because they're still power bow, they're still on a green dice, so the skull is still in play.
Absolutely, yes.
That's a very important point.
And if you're facing the foot, you've been reduced to white dice, but you still have the capability of evading, and then you also have the quite powerful melee capability once the unit has been weakened. So
you mentioned that if you want skill you dismount. the cavalry can't. If the cavalry dismount at the moment by the list, they stay the same skill. Is that correct?
If you dismount, there's actually an errata entry now, which allows them to shoot at the one level better.
Okay, so that although the list says they have the same skill, they're better if they're dismounted. Okay.
Indeed.
You've also changed the firearm how the firearm special rule works for pirates.
The pirates who this was to essentially not penalise them if they're actually being charged. So the skill level was previously I had dropped it a level if they were shooting with firearm. That seemed unduly harsh, so returned it so they fire with the same skill that they'd fire normally with the power bow.
I'm going to ask a slightly obscure technical question. What happens if they are charged by cavalry, superior cavalry? Because firearms on an S class an extra slow, but an S is now a wound because they are skilled shooters firing at superior.
So they still get the extra slow, but they get the wound as well.
Cool, that's fine. I suspect that question will come up at some point, which is why I am.
It will. It's actually quite an important change in favour of those the pirate chaps, because I remember playing Lee Sanders earlier this year, and after playing it, I worked out that actually I could be just charging them straight up with my cavalry because they stopped being power bow and turned into these unskilled firearm. So this is which just seemed daft.
Which oddly was going to be my tactic if I fought any of the samurai armies over the weekend, was to actually charge those pirates with my cavalry.
I mean, it's still worth considering, because if you get in, you will have avoided being shot at by power bow. But now that they will be experienced and get the extra slows, there's always that risk or possibility that you might not get in, and then you'll be a sitting target for the power bow.
Absolutely. It's I think it's a really good change. I mean, I don't know what the people's view on the overall changes. Because I mean, obviously people often overreact, especially online when changes are made, and get this army is ruined. What do people think those changes have impacted on those samurai armies? Graham, since you fought one at the last event?
Well, the only thing I really noticed was the lovely little voodoo doll of Richard that Stephen had in his camp. I wondered if Will had the same thing, Hammy.
No, Will didn't actually have the voodoo doll. I'm disappointed. Yeah, I'm feeling shortchanged, really.
Maybe I should set up a line of camps with voodoo dolls so people can.
I think that they were too many eggs in one basket. The thing is that they're so expensive as skill power bow that you have to come up with a plan to deal with them. So in my game against Will, my plan to deal with them was, well, they can kill one or two units that I don't care if they die, and they killed one and then got stuck. But that means that huge amounts of points were tied up and not able to do something else. So yeah, but I don't use Japanese armies, so.
Yeah, I just sort of like to point out that, because some people have commented that Richard and I have been dubious about the classification for some time, but I think it would be fair to say we hadn't got it on the horizon for making a change this year. But Lee Sanders, who used the Takeda samurai at Skull Rollers, raised the point. If these bow-armed cavalry were so good, why the hell did Takeda become lancers and actually became the most effective cavalry in Japan? The rules weren't reflecting this. So that was a cogent point, I think, made on that. And I would like, again, just for the benefit, for Richard's benefit in a way, saying there was discussion about this. It's not a random change, and the change, as with any significant change, they are discussed and they are considered. So that's my party line broadcast bit.
Can I move on to some of the changes that people may not have noticed or seem to have got less comment?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, there are three I would like to mention. The first is the change we made to the Romans, particularly Allied Roman contingents. So that in Roman Allied contingents, and this is the early Imperial Roman, the legionaries are now optional in Allied contingents, but cavalry have become compulsory. So that a Roman Allied contingent now has to have at least one tug of auxiliary and one tug of cavalry, thereby leaving it with only two remaining tugs for what was rapidly becoming a widespread use, which was the superior veteran legionaries. So we'll see how that impacts. But I think historically it's more accurate, because if you look at the contingents the Romans supplied to assist allies, it just generally seemed to be either contingents of cavalry and or auxilia that are actually there rather than legions. So that hopefully reflects more the historical scenario. Number two is a very minor one apparently, but I think will have a big impact on the list itself, and that's later Crusader. Just by actually giving the later Crusader army a few more knights. Having looked at the historical makeup of the armies in the battles that we have recorded, it was clear that there weren't enough outremer knights to represent the proportions of the armies at that time. So that's one that people might like to look at. The third one is, I think, Mr. Gaukroger needs to... Sorry, please.
Can I just ask about the Crusaders, the knights? How many ultramare knights can you have extra, and what are they, average or superior?
It's just a single tug. Sorry, I probably should have come better prepared.
Sorry if that's us.
Yeah,
just... You're planning on a Crusader army, Graham? You jumped on that one with alacrity.
No, it's just I've done absolutely no homework, so I thought I'd exploit Richard while he's there.
Yeah, so I think they were restricted to either 6 or 8. Now you can have 12 outremer knights, and then if you have a 3rd or 5th crusade, you can have another 8. They're 50-50 knights and sergeants.
Thanks.
So that's the change, and you can have military order knights on top of that. So you can actually end up with a later Crusader army that's got a pretty solid knight line. Not suggesting that's necessarily the best choice for a later Crusader army, but it does reflect the history. And does
okay, Richard, you've sold it to me. All cavalry Crusader army. No, I'm doing infantry, aren't I? Sorry, carry on.
I don't think you're allowed an all cavalry Crusader army, Matt.
Rats.
The third option, the third sort of list change I thought I'd mention would be the Hittite Empire. As I say, this is down to Mr. Gaukroger as much as anybody, who's now trying to look innocent. But this now doesn't have to have an Anatolian contingent. As Nick pointed out, there are examples of Hittite forces that just seem to draw either on the core kingdom or indeed on the eastern kingdoms, and didn't actually have an Anatolian contingent. And that opens up again a few different options for the Hittite Empire army, not necessarily stronger, but alternatives.
Yeah. I mean, having used it at warfare, I liked it with the Anatolian ally, but I think you're right. It's it reflects history again. It's a history reflection one, and just allows a bit more flexibility, because that having almost, having that ally practice as compulsory did restrict your choices a bit.
Indeed. I'll also want to take this opportunity to mention Graham, who is responsible for many of the typing corrections. He did an absolutely terrific job in proofreading and spotting a lot of the existing typing and grammatical errors. So any that remain, I wholeheartedly take responsibility for. But I guess I'll also mention the one change that I'm not happy with on reflection, and I think we may need further adjustment. That's actually the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire army list needed changing. It was actually was a bit of a mess, because the history of the Incas is prior to a particular date, I think 1438. They really are a very minor sort of kingdom of Cusco as it's known, and then they suddenly go on this dramatic expansion up and down the Andes. Now I think we've reflected the kingdom of Cusco correctly. I'm much happier with that sort of pre-1438 army. I think we have perhaps penalised the Inca Empire army too harshly, and I think that's one where I think we will need to make some further adjustments.
You got any thoughts on timescales for that, Richard? Obviously, you won't want to rush it, but I've got various ideas which I'd like to run through. Hopefully, we can make some adjustments reasonably quickly without having to wait till 2023 for that one. But that's down to other people taking a view on what I think and Simon agreeing to make the changes. Yeah, I have no views. The whole of the Americas are something.
I think, to be fair, not many people run South American armies in competition. So I suspect there aren't many people who are going to be greatly affected by that.
No, just for my education, just for my education, is that because they're rubbish or because most people don't have the figures?
I think it's a combination of a lot of people don't have figures. I think the problem with South American armies is they're actually very difficult to represent. The lack of cavalry inevitably tends to hinder them in any sort of competition where you get strong cavalry armies. And I think realistically, the terrain rules again are difficult to reflect the peculiar nature of Meso and South American warfare.
Yes.
So it's a case of we're on the boundaries of what you can do with a general rule set.
Yeah.
I think you could
need a rule that gave them PBS for some of their infantry. Or scouting for some of their infantry, wouldn't you? To give them a chance of getting decent terrain, but perhaps I'm getting off piste here, sorry.
If you think about it, the Libyan army that I took down to warfare had virtually no cavalry. Okay, it had two tugs of chariots, but that's not really a lot, and they didn't really function that much as cavalry in any of the games because I downgraded them so far. I think you could build an army. I'd need to look at the South American lists to see what you could do, but I think along a similar line, if there's a skirmisher heavy option in one of the South American armies, I think it's feasible to make it workable.
Inca actually can have an awful lot of slingers.
It
isn't a useless army by any means, but I think with the changes it made, I think perhaps we veered too much to And anyway, so it's something I propose to do a bit of further work.
Okay.
The other change, which isn't a list change that I would like to mention, is the points changes to camps, because this came about in reflecting that that a lot of the camp options people by and large weren't terribly keen on, or thought were overpriced. So we've actually done a bit of tweaking, and for example, mobile camps and fortified camps, if they're poor, are now 72 points cheaper than they were previously. And in fact, a mobile camp has now moved to 126 points, and is actually only 18 points more expensive than an unfortified camp. So,
I tried using no camp in one event, and at the end of the event concluded that it was an utter waste of points to have no camp. I think the points from no camp have gone down as well, haven't they?
They have. They've gone down by 108 from 486 to 378.
Basically, I ran no camp with an all-mounted army, defended in 2 games, so you've got a camp anyway, invaded in the other 2, and in no game did anybody get anywhere near my camp. So it was utterly pointless. Just a waste of, I wasted about 300 points, I think, on that. So
I think for some armies it can be useful, but I think, as I've mentioned before, I think you have to construct your army you have to load it to be the invader as best you can.
I did.
And I think it won't be useful for all cavalry armies anyway. But I think a cheaper option is definitely a better option.
Well, we'll keep the no camp option under review, and if it's still not considered of any value, we might tweak that even further. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, the one tweak actually is worth mentioning is that even an unfortified camp, that has actually become 18 points cheaper. So if you had an army that was 1,006 points, 10,006 rather, with a bit of luck, you might actually now be able to use it.
Could I possibly press you on a couple of the other bigger changes?
By all means.
What
is you? What
well,
you
I will say they are ones that have generated discussion on the forum. So that it immediately tells you what they are, Richard. But I'm just wondering if perhaps we should touch on them in this podcast, if only to say get Graham, Hammy's, and Matt's view on the changes, because I know we're pretty much of one mind on the majority of them.
Okay. So Sassanid Persian infantry. The middle Sassanid Persian now has an option for swordsmen who are formed close, with no sort of melee weapon, but with the melee expert characteristic average. The arguments are all on the forum, and I don't propose to repeat them here. But as Nick has indicated, the source for the change is Ammianus, and it's his description of the Sassanid Persian infantry as equipped like Mamillos, who were a form of Roman gladiator.
Could I say it's both the early and the middle Sassanid Persian?
Oh, apologies.
Yeah. So it's the early end. So you get protected close formation, average melee expert. But the late
thing, in my opinion, I mean, if there's evidence for them, even if the evidence is not a lot, although we might get onto the French knights and the Welsh army in a minute, I've got more evidence than one line for that.
So yeah. There are some other infantry changes for the Sassanids as well, Richard.
There are. The later Sassanids get Dailami style infantry, which is again, I won't bore the details. The evidence is, I think some academics believe it's very strong, others perhaps are slightly more doubtful. It depends. The sources for the late Sassanid period tend to be Arabic rather than Persian, and it's what credibility I think we give to some of those Arabic sources. Incidentally, the same sources have also created an interesting option for the Gok Turks, who can now take elephants, which creates a very intriguing horse archer army.
It does, and we had a little play test of it, didn't we, Richard?
We did.
You used the Gok Turks and I used the Sassanid, and yeah, it was a good game, and it was an interesting addition to a steppe cavalry army. I think interesting options. I'm going to take this opportunity to say that I am at the less convinced end of the spectrum on the Dale Army infantry, especially for the later Sassanid. But as Richard said, the sources are pretty poor for the late Sassanids anyway. So it's definitely not. I'm going to die in a ditch and have a raging argument with Richard about it.
I would also comment that I still think the stronger Sassanid Persian options are the ones with cavalry. I don't think the Sassanids will ever become a killer infantry army.
I have no intention of changing mine.
If you want a killer infantry army, there are other ways of doing it. So it's nice to have some infantry and some decent terrain troops in a cavalry army is a nice bonus. Again, if there's some sort of evidence for it, there's plenty of other things that are sketchier than that are allowed. Like, maybe Thracian horse archers, for example. They're a bit thin on the ground for evidence, but they're in most lists of most games. So,
I actually think there's actually some quite strong evidence for Thracian horse archers, but they probably are confused up with Scythian horse archers. It depends whether you treat the Getae as a Scythian army or a Thracian army.
Yeah,
perhaps. But yeah, I mean, there are so many lists that there's always, it's difficult to have complete confidence, and there's always that debate as to what is actually a fantasy list or what is a historical list with very little evidence. And Trojan War lists, for example, are that sort of boundary between how accurate is Homer reflecting something that may have happened possibly 400 years earlier, possibly 150 years earlier, depending on what you believe on the chronology.
And you always get the problem that in the past history didn't exist, because if you look at the paintings of Roman soldiers that are done in Renaissance Italy, they look surprisingly like Renaissance soldiers rather than Romans.
Yes.
Yeah, I suspect
it does get worrying when academic historians use them as evidence for what Roman armies look like.
Yes, absolutely.
On the other hand, I suspect you could do a really beautiful Roman army with Renaissance figures.
Yeah,
I do actually. I seem to recall a long time ago somebody suggesting doing an Alexandrian army, because there's some lovely Renaissance paintings for the Romance of Alexander, which has the companions are early 16th century gendarmes with the massive plumes and the base coats over the armour, and all his pikemen are lanzknechts in the puffed and slashed. So you could actually do a sort of Renaissance themed Alexandrian army. And I'm sure it could look beautiful, but utterly wrong.
You do know Will is now taking notes on that. Mr. Denham is now planning his next army.
In 10 mil.
Yes.
It's along the lines of the infamous Robbo threat to do a Hussite army, but with figures from about 600 years wrong date-wise.
Yeah.
As in 1918 rather than sort of 13, 14, 18.
Yeah, there's lots of possibilities there, but yeah.
I don't think there's a problem adding, if there's some evidence crops up and we get some evidence of, however skinny the evidence of something that could be there, I don't think it breaks the game. It just changes armies and gives you a little bit of a new variety or a tweak. Yeah. I'm all for it.
Yeah, and as long as we're cautious, as long as you're cautious on those thin evidence bits, and I certainly don't think those Sassanid swordsmen in any way turn Sassanid.
You don't want to completely distort an army. That's the only thing I would say. If the evidence is thin, you don't want it if it's going to completely distort an army.
No.
But other than that, I'm usually fairly comfortable.
As long as the point system works and the game ties together, it's like if you go back to DBM, the DBM days, there was pretty much no army in DBM that wouldn't be made better by giving it six fast light horse, because fast light horse were well worth the points if you had a small amount of them. But actually, plenty of meg armies would not be made better by adding a unit of skirmishing light horse.
Yeah, my view is that meg points are pretty damn good.
I think they are. I think it's like what the problem with the samurai. Yes, they're nowhere near as good mounted now, but you've saved a boatload of points.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll put it. Richard, and myself, of course, talking about the Sassanid infantry. We've missed the other change, which I persuaded Richard to do on the Middle Sassanids, which I'm really pleased he put in, although it does raise as another question for some years down the line, which is they can field all their mounted horse archers as cataphracts, horse archers, fully armoured horse, experienced bow.
Okay.
I'm not sure it's a good idea.
I have tried it, and I did. It did better than I anticipated. Let's put it like that. But it is an interesting option. Obviously, you being armoured horse, you can't evade.
Mm-hmm.
But being armoured horse, if you're shot at, you've got the extra protection, and being fully armoured, you in effect get a factor in combat. So it becomes an interesting army to use.
I suspect it's one that's interesting to use in the odd game. Possibly not the greatest choice in a four game competition.
I don't think it'll appear as a winning competition army too many times.
Again, you often see pictures of Sassanid cavalry with lots and lots of armour, and so yeah.
Oh yeah, if anybody wants the justification, I can quite happily pass that on to them. I persuaded Richard, so
one I noticed that is actually kind of more significant because it actually introduces a new rule, or at least a new class of new. I don't know. It's not a characteristic, isn't it? Which is the cavalry killer,
the horse killer.
Horse killer.
Yeah, we've. This isn't a new rule because this was already in the early German list.
Yes.
But we've just formalised it as a points characteristic. So you now pay points for it. So the horse killers they're described by Caesar in the context of German cavalry, and they were also used by classical Greeks. And essentially the cavalry get a marker, which is a skirmisher marker. And as long as the cavalry don't move more than skirmisher distance at any point, then they can count melee expert characteristic against opposing enemy cavalry.
Makes sense.
So, because the role of the horse killers was basically to grab onto the manes, jog alongside the horses, and then try and hamstring the horses when they got into a combat.
Mm-hmm.
So the other two, which we've also added as characteristics, are the shield, cover and shoot, which again is nothing new. It was there previously in the lists, but now is a paid for characteristic.
Okay.
And it's been applied to essentially the Pavisias in Genoese and other similar Italian states. The final one is the spear protection characteristic, which we've given to the Nicephorian Byzantine regraded scutatoi. The effect of this is like one rank of long spear, in the sense that you don't get a weapon factor, but you get the cancellation effect against cavalry, or chariots. That's impact.
So is that changing the units from being one rank of spear and 2 ranks of bow to being all bow but with spear protection or something?
Essentially, yes. So the reason for this was people were starting to deploy the regraded scutatoi 4 deep with 2 ranks of long spear and 2 ranks of bow, and then use them like mobile tank killers, which was never the intention, nor is reflected in the history, where Byzantine infantry in the manuals are described very much as being in a defensive posture. And it actually has been pointed cheaper, although other changes actually adjust the points system back to pretty much where they were. The front ranker now of the regraded scutatoi are drilled flexible. The argument for this was actually that if they were in rough terrain, if their front rank was close, you had the absurd situation where other opposing archers would be better off charging them, because the close would be -2 from the fact of being close, and that just didn't seem right.
It increases the amount of shooting they get, presumably, though. So if you're a unit previously, if you're a unit of 6, you'd be on a.
They've got the same number of shooting bases as they ever had.
Yeah, they were bow.
The old formation had long spear and bow on the front rank.
Oh, right, okay.
Rank, so it's still basically a shooting formation that is got resistance against cavalry,
right?
And is essentially, as Richard just said, it's more suitable to a more defensive posture shooting,
which is what they did. So
it's
I have no problems with that. I'm sure some people with Nicephorian armies will go, "Oh, woe is way."
Okay, I think we'll close this list bit out with a couple of quickies. Hammy, do you want to mention your Owen Glendower?
Well, he's not changed in yet. I will dig out the books. I am still convinced that there should be an option for Owen Glendower to have a French ally, small French ally. There were, I think, 2,500, 3,000 French that came over. I can give you a breakup of the force, tell you how many were crossbowmen, how many were knights. I can give you the names of their leaders, and I can tell you where they stood. It stood with the Welsh army opposite the English army, but they didn't fight a battle. That's pretty likely to actually have been there. It's just they chose not to fight. I'm sure if you dig around, you can actually find records of the jousting that went on between the French knights and the English knights in between the two armies while they were bored waiting to fight.
Okay, well, I think
it would certainly be one for scenario games that I would have no problem at all with. For competition, my only fear is that it would you wouldn't see a Welsh army without a French ally. That's my
yes. And I think you have to be careful. You can't use a straight French. You can't use it as a straight French ally. You can't take a full ally from the French list. But I think there should be an option for French troops within the Welsh army.
Maybe
just to stir things up. If they never actually fought, maybe they should be compelled to take a mediocre allied general, so maybe they won't fight.
I was going to say maybe they ought to be mandatory starting as unreliable.
Well, then the English would have started the battle, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think when Hammy says they didn't fight, the armies lined up and just didn't fight. It's very similar to the army of, in that case, very similar to the army of Edward III, which justifies, I think, some German spearmen, because again, that was in a campaign where no actual fighting took place.
the two armies lined up opposite each other and then had to think about it and then went back to camp and then they did it again the next day and then they did it again the next day and then they got bored. Well, actually, I think the Welsh ran out of supplies and had to retire. But
okay,
yeah.
I think we could put that one down to. We'll leave that with you to put a proposal up on the forum, shall we?
Yes, why not?
Thank you. After that, I've just got a couple of quick questions because Ian Newell kindly sent in a couple of questions when I requested this. One is asking about devotio, the deliberate suicide of leaders to encourage their troops. He said there's examples with Etruscans and Roman commander at Centium. Could it be covered in the rules, basically? I suppose he's asking for a special rule.
Maybe we should put one in for scenario games. I'm not. If it's a rules one, then it's really down to Simon. But certainly maybe something for scenario games we could suggest within the lists.
Okay, and I'm going to handle his other question because he asked about Ottoman Ghazis in the early Ottoman list, which he says frequently referred to as fanatics and classed as such in other rules. And basically, you say, why does Meg classify them as average horse archers up to 3/4 skilled shooters? So basically, as Turkmen horse archers and not as some sort of fanatic types. And this is basically a long-standing misunderstanding of what Ghazi means. Ghazi is just a fighter for the faith. I mean, it certainly included various nutters and people seeking martyrdom and whatever, but in itself, it doesn't really have any connotation of fanaticism. That's a sort of an old-fashioned 19th century Western view of Arabs, and certainly the troops that are called Ghazis in the early Ottoman lists were basically just Turkmen tribesmen and should be reflected as such. So I'm perfectly happy with that. We probably need to take the bit in the list note out that's been there forever and probably inherited from previous sets of rules going back to the 1970s that mentions fanatics, because it isn't right. So anyway, that just allowed me to show off a bit. So that's why I insist on that one. But thanks Richard for covering those, because I know some of them cause a lot of heat online, and if you're in charge of it, you get flack. And thank you for people for commenting on that. So I think we should move on now to, as we said at the beginning, sort of maybe finish off the episode with a sort of look back, look forwards bit. Obviously, 2021 was curtailed at the beginning by COVID, but we got competitions up and running, and we've had a healthy number of new players to Meg this year. So I think perhaps if again I can ask Graham to kick this bit off by his reflection of him and his close friends in the Bun Shop guys who joined us on the Meg competition circuit this year. Just how they felt it goes. Did they enjoy it? Did they like the competitions, the themes? What could we do better for newer players on the competition circuit? What do we do well? What do we do badly? It's what. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you. Look, I think you do most of it well. It's a good game system. I think it's a nice, clean system of play. There's enough depth to explore. The lists really are, I think, a strong point. There's so much variety of classification. You could argue occasionally that having 17 and a half different ways of classifying a unit that has a limited number of shooting options is questionable, but I like it. It's the chrome that Fog lacked and made Fog in the end, a boring game. Meg has got more chrome than a very chromy thing, and I like that. That's good. Despite that, the points are well balanced, as you said 10 minutes ago, Nick. I think that's a really good job there. Maybe there's a bit too much freedom in picking the lists. You can play an awful lot of tunes with the list. There's not many compulsory picks. I don't have a particular problem with that because, let's face it, the sources are fairly poor, but I don't know, perhaps it's something you could look at longer term. The community, I think, is really good. I think it's you've got a lot of very enthusiastic players. It's competitive. You see different names in the top 3 of most competitions. If I'm looking for something to be critical about, it will be the way the card holding game works. That I'm going to keep I'm going to pass, then I'm going to throw away a black, then I'm going to throw away a white, then I'm going to throw away a green, and nope, now I'm going to throw away yellow. It's a bit artificial to get that last move. I appreciate what it's trying to represent, keeping the initiative and so on and so on. But it's sometimes it feels very gamey, but I'm okay with that because I'm a very gamey player when I get the hang of things. The competitions, they sell out in no time flat, 2 or 3 days, don't they? Often just on the pre-warning on the MeG Rollers WhatsApp group. Now, on the one hand, that's a sign of a really healthy community. You're very keen. But if you want to grow it, then I think it would be good if you had bigger venues and occasionally didn't quite fill them, so that newer players who aren't going to sign up and get in a day and a half flat get a chance to get a sniff that there's something going on, think about it, bring some friends along, and so on. So I suggest that might be something to look at. Get some venues that you're not quite sure you can fill, and okay, maybe it doesn't work once or twice, but it would be good to get new players in that way. The only other thing I was going to suggest is something that GK Graham Wilmott keeps coming back to, and I think he's misunderstood by most ancient players 99% of the time, because we can't understand the depth of his ignorance. That's his words, not mine. You will talk about Khwarizmians, Sassanids. You said Ammianus, and we all nodded. If you're coming to it from a World War II background, or not being a million years old and knowing about thousands of years of history, it's all Greek, excuse the obvious pun. It would be really helpful, he keeps saying, to have on the wiki something that says this is what these troop types are. When it says this long Greek word, it means a man with a pointed stick this long and not having too much armor. And here's a picture, and here's some of the suppliers. And we have spurts of enthusiasm on the WhatsApp group, and people put something there, but it's not really what GK's after. And I wonder if perhaps at some stage we need to put a group of people, maybe 1 or 2 of the people here, GK, almost certainly Paul Cummins, and flesh out exactly what it would be good to have on the wiki, and then see if we can find some people willing to do something that will be useful to Graham, and therefore people we might tempt in from Warhammer or other dark reaches of the world who don't know about Ammianus and so on, and see if we can build a resource that will be helpful to people who don't know what the hell ancient wargaming is, who don't know what a Sassanid is. Yeah, that's it.
I think that's a really good idea, because I think there's one thing that's been said about MeG as it's grown, is it's pulled in quite a lot of people who aren't existing ancient medieval wargamers. It's essentially people have got into their rule sets, and you don't get a lot of movement between rule sets unless a rule set has reached the end of its life for whatever reason, and then there's a change. We're growing through other means, so I think that's got a lot of legs in terms of it being a good idea. And what other people think.
Well, I certainly think it's a good idea. Having done the troop notes on the lists, because the MeG lists do have troop notes on each of the lists. It is a lot of effort. One resource I do have, which actually I need to talk to Paul about, is I have done maps showing where each of the lists actually were located at his various historical dates. The reason I've never been able to publish them is the actual size of the images. But that may be something that I could approach Paul about, seeing if we could address, because that's certainly another issue that I know people have. We talk about Khwarizmians, as you say, but where the hell did the Khwarizmians actually come from? And that sort of thing as well. Yeah. I'll mention one thing I'm actually planning for the 2023 list, sad to say, is actually I've been looking at restructuring the notes sections so that the notes are actually with the troop types rather than being listed at the end, so that people don't miss some of the restrictions or some of the details. So that's something I'm hoping I can incorporate into the 2023 lists.
Nice.
Yeah, but I think it's there's obviously. Thank you for the bits where you say we're getting it right. Because it has to be said that the competition side of it is organised by enthusiasts. You get people like Will, who organises the competitions at Swords and Boards, Pete Entwistle and Jeff Pearson, the Ribble ones. Ray Duggins has been doing a lot, and of course Hammy is involved in a lot of these. Anything that's run at Battlefield Hobbies, Hammy is part of facilitating that. And not just as the owner, so he gets bums on seats. He's got a certain amount of player input into that as well. So it's good to know that those things are being done. But I think the really useful to hear those. We can, that all of us in the community can take on those things about you saying about how we can make it better especially for newer people coming in. Because we do have lots of people expressing interests from outside of the old lags who've been playing since WRG, fourth in the case of Hammy, fifth in the case of me, in the 1970s, or third for Hammy. So he's just, I'm a newcomer.
I'm glad it wasn't second edition, judging by the
second edition didn't exist. It was only printed for the Nationals, the same as first. The first published one was third.
Yeah.
It was this
I know.
the video I just saw.
It's the way you're indicating it on the camera. Okay, so thank you very much, Graham, for that.
One thing that's worth mentioning, I think, at this point, is that Simon is in the process of organising a bunch of intro events. The first of them is going to be at Battlefield Hobbies on the 8th of January. That's already advertised on our website. Tickets are up and some have been sold. So there you go. How about that? That's going to be introduction to MeG Pacto and also Divisions of Steel, the new World War II rules he's working on. I believe he's intending running similar events at shops all through the country over the year. But yeah, if people are interested in learning and want to come somewhere in the middle of the country, 8th of January, Battlefield Hobbies will be the first of these events.
I certainly intend to run a Pacto event later in the year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it can only be a good thing, I think. Some variety, again, it's all very easy for those of us who've got 20, 30 years collections to run a Maximus-sized army. It's a big investment. Especially if as some people will, they find they don't actually like it. If you bought 60 to 100 bases worth of troops, that's a big investment. But you can get in on the game on a much. Leave your Libyans aside, Hammy, with stupid numbers of bases. So a much more manageable project to get up and running with Pacto. And just on that, I think I'm hoping that Simon will be able to come on a podcast fairly soon to elaborate on his plans for doing those introduction sessions for MeG and inevitably other games as well. Reg, the Renaissance version, will be released at the start of next year. Okay, mentioning next year, looking forward. It's a bit of what are we looking forward to, guys? In terms of, Hammy's mentioned the 8th of January for that being run by Simon. Anything particular we're looking forward to? Any armies we're planning? Matt's already mentioned that he's thinking of jumping off his horses. So does this mean if your horsemen go in the woods, Matt, does this mean you're going to have like loose formation infantry in the open as your option now?
No, I think my close formation infantry are going to have to go into the wood. I think that's the only way it works.
Oh, right. So it'll merely be a change of who goes in the wood to be disadvantaged.
Pikes in the wood.
Don't tempt me. Just don't tempt me. I'd try it.
Anyway, so what are we looking forward to next year?
Playing some games. What I have found is actually after each event I've played this year, certainly the last 3 events, I've looked at the lists I used in each of those events and thought, I can make that better. So all the armies that I've used have been tweaked. So if I use them again, they would not be quite the same. And I think that the new version is better in each case. So I want to try out the new version to see if it proves to be better. That's 3 armies I've got to use again. And then there's all the other ones I've not used. I want to try and finish my Thracians. I'm doing some Thracians, so I want to get them done. Painting the horse archers at the moment as we speak.
Yeah, I suppose we're all hoping to have a full year's calendar allowed, but obviously that could be beyond our control with COVID still running around. Richard,
I have to confess that I'm. Having worked on the list changes, I haven't really reflected on what I'm going to be doing next year. At the moment, I've acquired some. But my main army building process is actually acquiring second-hand figures and rebasing them, picking up older style figures quite cheaply that way, and so. I'm getting more. This time I've got proper Sassanid elephants that will start appearing, hopefully at some opportunity.
Graham?
I don't know. Probably I'll have a go at Hittites at Ice and Fire, probably. Then I might run my Dacians out again. A bit like Hammy, I've tweaked my Dacian list after playing his horrible army of 3 types of troops that I couldn't cope with. So I've given them a few more shooty things, see if that makes them any better, because I did enjoy playing them. Running at things screaming, oh, it's an elephant, I'll charge it in the open, what could go wrong? As it turned out, remarkably little.
Well, it's the old, they're in small units and lots of white dice add up.
Yes.
So,
Devastating charge. I'll let them charge. Now they're your problem. After that, I don't really know. As I say, at some stage you want to use more shooty cavalry. The Hittites are a toe in the water, and I'll probably go the opposite path to Matt and start using more horses rather than less. Though I'm not guaranteeing putting them all in woods.
You don't know what you're missing.
Yeah.
He's missing at least a -2. So,
I like the way you think, Roger.
It's well, for myself, I'm really not. I think like everybody else, I'm not quite sure. For Ice and Fire, I'm thinking the later Zhu army, perhaps, because basically I'm finishing painting up that, having found figures I prefer to the ones I had. I'm just wondering if I am ever going to be brave enough to run the Khitan Lao at a competition.
Don't have to now.
But a full competition. Yeah, it's definitely an army. I'll run it for 2 games. 4, it's
Squeaky time.
It is, but I know every time I mention it, Matt will go on. But other than that, who knows? But yeah, I'm just really looking forward to a full year's calendar, I suppose. So, okay, I think probably at that point we've reached the natural end of this podcast. So once again, I'd just like to say many thanks to everybody who's taken part. Hammy and Graham for joining us as guests. Maybe we'll have you back. Maybe the punters will say replace the existing team.
No.
Thanks obviously to Richard for going through the list stuff and all his contributions. Matt, as ever, just for the insanity of repeatedly deploying cavalry in woods. And of course, the recording and editing that's now to be done. I suppose the last thing only goes to wish everybody here and everybody listening to us, a great Christmas and New Year. Hope Santa, or as my background has at the moment, Future Armor's Robot Santa, brings you what you deserve. And we'll leave it at that sort of vague and ambiguous statement. And everybody has a great holiday time, and we see each other early New Year, and our competitions are not held up by COVID. So again, thank you very much. See you all across the table sometime.
See you.
See you. Merry Christmas.
Happy Christmas. Bar humbug and all that.